Okay, thank you very much, Pat. And panelists and audience, thank you for joining us on your noon hour. And welcome to today's BC Support Unit webinar. It's going to be about 1 hour in length. My name is Lisa Ridgway, and I'm a patient partner with the BC Support Unit, also the co-host of the POR podcast called Sporecast. Our webinar today is called Research Teams with Patient Partners, Collaborating on Grant Writing. So this is the second part of an exciting two-part series. The other webinar, recorded just a short while ago, was called Patient Partners as Peer Reviewers, Getting Started. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the BC Unit YouTube channel. Now, we're recording the webinar for teaching and learning purposes, and also so that you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And because it's being recorded, panelists, I'd like to ask, no swearing, please. I know it's an exciting topic. So if we could please have the next slide. We're going to just do a few housekeeping matters, but first let's try the territorial acknowledgement. Back to the territorial acknowledgement, please, which should precede everything. Thank you very much. At the BC Support Unit here, we do acknowledge that the Hub office is within the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and Métis chartered communities of the Lower Mainland. Thank you very much for sharing the privilege. Next slide, please. We're going to go back to the housekeeping if we could. So speaking of housekeeping, God, you should see my house. So this housekeeping is very tidy in relationship to where I'm sitting. So as again, we have a question and answer capability and a chat function, which for me is found on the lower part of the bar running across the bottom of my screen. So please contribute to the chat and to the questions and answers, because we're going to be taking you up on your wonderful input at the end of our discussion. And we welcome your chat and we welcome your questions and answers. We are all muted, especially as the audience. It just makes for a better recording, and it helps, of course, with background noise. So questions that are submitted will be read aloud at the end of the interview. Now, today we have a magnificent panel, a really exciting panel of patient partners and a researcher, and I would really like to have included a healthcare provider in today's panel, but due to our COVID-19 pandemic, this is not possible. But I really do, on behalf of the BC Support Unit and the panelists here, want to thank all of the people in our health authority for helping to make this possible and helping to keep us safe. Now, the only other thing I'm going to remind our panel members about is jargon. We mustn't use too much jargon, please. So every acronym should be stated in full, and we'll have a jargon watch, I'm sure. If you, as our audience members, want to stretch, please get comfortable, relax. Panel members, it's okay to be nervous, and silence is okay too. So I just want to make sure everybody is comfortable before we begin. Next slide, if we may. This is the panel. So I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves for a minute or two to our audience. And I wonder, Kent, could you go first, please?
Thank you again, Lisa, and thank you again to those who have chosen to spend their lunch hours with us for this, what I called on Twitter, a serving of food for thought. And whether or not you were with us for the first in this series, you may remember that I am Cadogan-Loftsgard, and I am still a patient by virtue of my lived experience of congenital cerebral palsy and pediatric asthma. But my early childhood interactions with the health system, I like to say, taught me a lot more by demonstration than by declaration about the nature of really strong patient-centered care long before anyone I had heard from used that specific term. And that was all my initial inspiration to really begin putting healthcare at the center of much of my professional life, beginning while I was still a teenager with practical training in paramedicine, and then later in health specialty communications, journalism, and publishing. And in 2016, I was recruited into the founding efforts of the BC Support Unit as a result of my work with UBC's interdisciplinary healthcare education programming since the fall of 2011, where we also do several styles of what's now popularly called patient-oriented research.
Thank you, Kent. Sometimes we'll be using the POR acronym, but I appreciate you giving such a Top Gun introduction. Ruth, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing. My name is Ruth Laverne. I'm on faculty at Simon Fraser University, and I do research mostly in the area of primary care. So some of that is about the sort of services from family doctors and nurse practitioners that we all receive across the province. And some of that focuses in on populations that have traditionally faced barriers and been marginalized from services, including recent immigrants to Canada and folks managing mental health and substance use disorders as well. Most of it uses linked administrative data, so it's quite quantitative in focus, but I always work in close partnerships with folks who have qualitative expertise as well as with service providers and patients and policymakers.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for taking the time to join us. You were our guest at the last webinar too, so we really appreciate that. Marilyn from Kelowna, can you please introduce yourself as our next panel member?
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone across the province and whoever else may be watching. I am a senior. I am a complex care individual. And that's what really drew me to all of this work. I can say I have been on a research team, so I speak with some confidence in this process. And it's a learning journey. I love all of the work that I do with BC Support, and I'm really thrilled to be here today. Thank you.
Marilyn, thank you very much for coming and lending your expertise and your wisdom, senior or junior, it doesn't matter. You've got a strong voice in patient-oriented research. Thank you. And Annie, can you please introduce yourself? Annie, you may be on mute.
I'm sorry about that. Annie Richtera, I live in Vernon. I'm a patient partner with the BC Support Unit since rolling out the pilot program from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research in patient-oriented research. And I was always interested in research and applying it in my professional work as a pediatric nurse practitioner, as a health educator, and also I'm a patient with lived experience as living with blood cancer, as well as having a chronic disease pain syndrome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annie. You've been called upon an awful lot by the BC Support Unit lately to be this voice with our panels and webinars, so we really appreciate your time. Now, let's get into the actual heart of the discussion. It's exciting to have all you panel members here. And remember, please, to submit as the audience your questions, and we'll hopefully try and answer them and keep the chat going if you'd like. Thank you again to our great panelists. Next slide, please. So Kent, I wonder if you could start our discussion off with just a basic walkthrough of some of the funders for patient-oriented research and health research here in British Columbia. Go ahead, Kent.
Absolutely. So, Absolutely so, Lisa. Thank you so much. It's always a bit of a challenge for most of us to find the mute button at the opportune time. But carrying on to complement some of the colorful logos that we see there on the slide, one of the largest funders here in BC and in Canada is the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. And then we also see the logo there of CIHR that some of us have mentioned even before now. And as I've said in the past, those who get top marks for attention to detail will know that it's the Canadian Institutes, plural, of Health Research is what that initialism stands for. And why is it called Institutes? It's because CIHR is composed of a series of individual institutes, each of which focuses on a particular area of health study. And then the BC Support Unit that also administers the provincial part of the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research works closely in collaboration with Michael Smith to disseminate funding on behalf of CIHR, because BC Support Unit essentially functions like the provincial office of CIHR.
Thanks very much, Kent. That's a good overview. And as we get to the next slide, please, with the questions for our panel, I'd like to say I'm putting one person on the spot for each of these questions, but I would really like other panel members to jump in and add either their real life stories or their experiences. So let's get down to it. The first question is, how do patient partner roles vary in grant writing collaborations? And I'd like to start off, Kent, if you wouldn't mind just starting off this discussion, and we'll just go around the table for this one. Thanks, Kent.
Absolutely. Well, for me, I would say that those roles can vary right from sort of what I call the macro view of the writing project, just to make sure that it's in line with what we call patient-identified priorities, and then right down to the more micro view that can be even the assignment of writing specific parts or sections of the grant, or things like line editing and all of that sort of thing. In previous writing projects that I have even done with Ruth, often what happens to me because of my publishing background is that I might have to be reined in a little bit as far as the specificity of my of my contributions, because Ruth has been known to say things to me that were along the line of, the coarse tooth comb treatment will do, because the fine tooth comb treatment just isn't in the budget.
Thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Marilyn to ask the same question. Then we'll get to Annie and Ruth. So Marilyn, how do patient partners' roles vary in grant writing collaborations?
I think, first of all, they really vary according to your level of experience. Let's face it, Ruth is our pro here, and Kent, not to say you're not as well, but as a patient partner, what I needed to look at was, what are my existing skills? And that's what my PI looked at as well. The lead on the research team, I may be able to review. It may be as simple as providing a letter of support as a patient partner and saying, yes, I believe in this work. And it may be too, you may be a subject matter expert or for knowledge translation. You may be the individual that maybe has this challenge, and you may be able to add value to the writing through that process.
Thanks very much, Marilyn. Ruth, you've been mentioned throughout, so please jump in and add what you'd like to say to that question.
So totally agree with Kent that this can vary enormously. So some of that is shaped by the funding call itself. So there are times when we have a really long lead time, for example, for one of the main CIHR project grants. We know when that call typically will be sometime in advance. We can plan, we can put together a team, we can really think carefully about roles and what works and how folks would like to be involved. Sometimes we're faced with quicker turnarounds and we have to do a little bit more on the fly, and that can sort of shape how everyone's involved in the process, not just patient partners. But when I'm approaching it, I really try to think about sort of key features of patient-oriented research so that it's done in partnership with patients, that it answers research questions that are that matter, and that it measures outcomes that matter. But at the grant writing stage, sometimes that can mean involving multiple patients with different asks. So for me, sometimes that includes having someone who's integrated in the team as a key member from start to finish. But sometimes that's not enough. So for example, in work around primary care, where people have very different experiences and needs, members of the BC Primary Care Research Advisory have played a role where a number of patients can provide higher level feedback on a grant that's in process. So even if the expectation is not that they'll be involved for the life cycle of the project, sometimes it can be helpful to reach out for more diverse input. And then I've also had the experience, especially in getting to those like outcomes that matter, that it may be that I reach out to a colleague that I've worked, or patient colleague who I've worked with in the past, just for some more focused advice, really trying to nail down the outcomes. Again, they might not have bandwidth to take on the whole project, but really some focused questions around shaping the outcomes, shaping the objectives can be helpful. So just as I involve colleagues with different expertise in a number of different ways in preparing for a grant, the same can absolutely apply with those sort of key features of patient-oriented research in mind.
Oh, I love that answer, Ruth. That was fantastic because it shows that different patient partners can contribute over the grant writing process in different ways. Yeah. So thank you very much. And Annie, I wonder if we could just ask you to finish up this discussion matter. How do patient partner roles vary in grant writing collaborations?
Yeah, I totally echo what was said so far, so that patients can be really involved in different ways, like proofreading or critiquing. But what I always found very powerful is writing a statement, an impact statement. So why is this research important? Or like your story, how does it affect you or your community? And why do you support it? So putting a story to it makes it more human, puts this human face on it. Also, patients really can look, is it really patient-oriented? Are the patients involved meaningfully and throughout the research cycle? So putting this lens, the public lens to it. As well as I found quite often what I was asked is to make sure especially the lay summary is understandable, and is it a language what people when they read and though they can understand, it makes sense to it, the avoiding acronyms and so on. So the lived experience I find is a really important aspect to it, and for the researchers, it's not just the lived experience as a patient, but also they can use skills like Ruth said already and Kent mentioned as well, in terms of other skill sets like personal and professional, from your life experience, from your professional experience. So there is the patient and the public can be a good resource for grant writing.
Thank you, Annie. We could do a whole other webinar on letters of support and written impact statements, but we'll move on because one thing you did bring up that's so exciting to me is that the lived experience that patient partners bring to grant writing is really the value add to the whole process. So I'd like to move back to you, Ruth, if we could please. The next question for you and for other panel members once you've finished is, how can researchers effectively recruit and orient and maybe even retain a multi-stakeholder team that includes really integrated patient partners?
Sure. So in an ideal world, I guess where possible, what I've tried to do is to build relationships that make it possible to respond to individual calls, but that support sort of a team that's is sort of independent of any specific funding application. For me, what's an important step, for example, was working collaboratively to identify priorities for research. So even if there wasn't a specific funding call in mind, again, within primary care through the Primary Healthcare Research Network, we worked together to come up with patient-identified priorities so that if something came up that might be relevant and might align, we'd be in a position to rapidly respond. That being said, that's not always possible. Sometimes a funding call comes along and we're really sort of pumped about the opportunity, but to make sure that we have the right people at the table, I've reached out through Patient Voices Network, through colleagues in other provinces to identify patient partners with relevant expertise to that specific funding call. So where possible, I'd really encourage thinking about that network and relationships sort of independently of a specific application, but sometimes it's totally sort of for practical reasons, it makes sense to sort of come around the table for a specific funding call. And the same is true of other researcher collaborators or policymaker collaborators. I think in terms of really working as a team though, the things I try to pay attention to are communication around expectations, communication around timelines, and then ultimately communication of the results of the funding competition. So again, this is true of all team members, but being really active and checking in with everyone about what they can contribute, how they'd like to be involved. And that, again, it might be that I really value someone's expertise, but they're not actually, they'd like to sort of play an advisory role and they're not able to actively contribute to all aspects of writing. Or it might be that someone really wants to take ownership of a specific part of a grant or project. And I only know that through communicating with them. And then, again, oftentimes timelines are beyond our control, but at least being really clear about what to expect when you're going to be asked to provide input, when any things that I've asked that we've sort of agreed that you'd lead would be expected in leading up to the grant submission. And then there's often this like really awkward pause as we wait to hear the results, and that can be months and months and months. So just making sure that people know what to expect in terms of the sort of hurry up and wait of grant writing, that when they'll actually hear back, and again, it might be that things are sort of radio silent while we focus on other things in the meantime, but just being really clear about those expectations and communications. And again, that applies to any team member, but I think it's all the more important if someone hasn't been part of the timelines of academic research before.
Great. Other panelists, please.
I just wanted to say, Ruth, that the point you made at staying in contact, and especially the feedback at the end, like if you get the results from grant writing. So if it takes a long time before you hear back from the funding agency, just in between, send out an email or a quick text and say, it's like, still didn't hear back from it, but we'll let you know and stuff. So just keep this line of communication open. This is very important, because then we feel as patient partners, we feel a part of the team and welcome. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Annie. Maybe we should move on to the next question just for the sake of time, but we'll have a last comment section at the very end of all the questions. Marilyn, the next question is for you. How can this research team help patient partners be comfortably prepared for all aspects of the grant writing process?
Well, I have to say, first of all, Ruth, you absolutely are correct. Setting the expectations. It needs to be critical right from the start for a patient partner, so they know exactly where they're going on this journey. I think, first of all, ask how can you contribute? As the patient partner, there's some onus here to this is a two-way process. And so I think that really asking how you contribute and being clear once those expectations have been discussed. And as the lead, maybe tell them, ask that question, what do you need? Or in your experience level, there may be things that like readings that you could give them, and maybe it's just guidance and support throughout the process. I often relate to this research process as being brand new. And although I am no longer brand new, I relate when we do these kinds of webinars to those who have never been in this process. And I think that, just making sure, step out and make sure you know what it is and look for and ask for the guidance. I think as well with the lead, including the partner in that kickoff meeting can help as well, making sure they're right from the start at the kickoff on the discussions of what the process is going to be. And, I think as well, checking in on your progress. If you're getting that support and someone is checking in, anyone from the team really is checking in and saying, how are you doing? What can we help with? What do you need? And communication. It really is the bottom line through all of this process. Annie mentioned it already. Sometimes the lead time with CIHR is a long time, and we then have to sit and wait. And I think sometimes as a patient partner, we're concerned that should I take something else on, because this is a long time, and sometimes my concern is overcommitting. But I've realized through this last almost 5 years, just put your foot out there, and as time moves forward, often you can balance these research projects because they are different and they do take place over different timelines.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that very complete from sort of checking in to checking out phase. Other panelists, please. All right. Well, Marilyn, you obviously gave a very complete answer, so that was wonderful. Thank you for summing it up so eloquently.
Thank you.
Ruth, we're going to punt the next one back to you, if you don't mind. Can you tell us a little bit? I'm not sure I want to use the word pressures, but sort of, like isobars in a weather map, things are shifting all the time. But what are the competing interests or the pressures on team members within the actual grant writing process? And I guess a follow-up question would be, how do you help patient partners understand the grant agencies and their priorities? So that's a big one, but we'll start off with you. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I think it is a big one. I think the sort of four main things I'd highlight is those sort of questions around alignment. You're trying to get things to line up between what the funding call is for and what your team's really good at doing and what interests might be. So alignment. Oftentimes sort of agreeing and navigating the scope of a project requires a lot of conversations. And then the two other things are just the time pressures inherent to some competitions, and also the generally pretty low success rates in managing expectations. But I'll go through all of those in sequence. So with respect to alignment, again, when a funding agency comes out with a call, sometimes they're a completely open call and we're free to submit investigator-initiated or team-initiated projects on any topic. And so in that case, we're not sort of limited by priorities of the funding competition, but we need to be able to reach an agreement within the team about what the priority is, and that can take some conversation. Where we are trying to align what we're interested in doing with another funding competition, sometimes that can be even more challenging, especially if team members are really keen about one aspect of a project and it just doesn't sort of align with the opportunity. So that can be challenging. And related to that is scope. The fact that, and we're doing research in an area because there's important work to be done. And so it can be really hard to say, actually, like at this time, I have capacity, or what's reasonable to be funded is only this much, even though we'd love to do this much. And one of the like really exciting things I find about working with patient partners is the amazing ideas and the energy to do new research. So I will admit I'm often in the position to be like, I love all of that, but we should really focus on this piece right now and take that in sequence. Or and that can be, you know, a challenging conversation because we really do want to see it all get done. Then with respect to time pressure, I mean, I think people have brought up the theme of communication, and sometimes these are like in tension, where as we're scrambling to meet a deadline, those are the times when we really drop the balls with respect to communication. And again, in an ideal world, we have like a lot of time and lead up to really structure things nicely. But especially in the context of funding calls related to COVID-19, there's been a lot of uncertainty and really rapid turnaround that, and as people are juggling lots of balls, managing caregiving roles, it simply has been difficult to sort of do everything as well as we'd like to. So sometimes I have to ask for forgiveness around having like missed some emails that should have gone out, for example. And again, even in the best of times when you have a long lead up, everyone sort of faces competing time pressures, and it's usually a little bit of a scramble towards the end. And then the final piece that I find really challenging is given success rates, oftentimes we're looking at about like 1 in 10 for many grant calls. Sometimes we receive disappointing news. And so sometimes I'm like a little slow in communicating that to the team just because I'm myself kind of bummed about it and I don't really feel like sending an email. But anyway, usually do that pretty quickly. And then we're sort of faced with the decision around what do we do next. Sometimes it's really clear we really want to resubmit. Other times, based on the feedback that we've received or how contexts have changed, it's necessary to say like, we gave it a shot, but I'm not sure that this is going to be where we're going next. And that can be really difficult. So again, all of this just requires communication to navigate, but I think have been sort of consistent pressures that teams I've been involved with have faced.
Great.
Sorry, I think I just talked for 5 minutes about pressures.
No, that's fine. I'm just going to ask the other panelists to jump in, but I would say one important part, if I can add, is to share that feedback with patient partners, whether it is good feedback or perhaps it's constructive feedback that can be used the next time you submit. So please, other patient partners on the panel, what can you tell us?
Well, Lisa, I'll jump in. I kind of categorize this into 2 areas when I look at pressures. The one is logistics. Ruth has kind of talked about those things. When I say logistics, I say, for instance, the need to tick a box. You know, when we go through this process, there are certain things and steps we have to follow, and absolutely timelines. The deadlines are critical and probably put the most pressure on when they are short turnarounds. And so there are a number of logistics, even finding a patient partner that is a good match for the submission of the grant early on can be a big challenge and a big pressure that's put on the existing team members. But I also categorize self-pressures. And when I say self-pressures, I think of from the patient partner perspective. So it's those feelings of, and again, thinking of people brand new to this process, it's the feelings of inexperience. I've never done this before. What am I going to do? How am I going to really add value to this team? The feelings of being unprepared. You know, do I have the skills? And so I think those self-pressures from a patient partner perspective really stress and add to what those pressures are over and above the team itself.
Wow. Go ahead, Annie.
I totally agree with that. And that's where, like, I'm a big fan of mentorship. So if you can bring in more than one patient partner, what you should anyway, but if you team them up and that somebody with more experience and somebody new in the field, that you can team them up and they can help each other and build up these experiences and expertise. I think that's very important.
Annie, it's so funny what you and Marilyn are saying, because who hasn't felt a bit of imposter syndrome? What am I doing here in the middle of this grant writing about pharmacogenetics in depression models? So we've all felt a little bit of it. Kent, I'd like to move on, if I could, please, to a question for you. And I think the other panelists will want to join in on this one. What can researchers do for patient partners to optimize our experience in the grant writing process?
Just before we get to that, I just wanted to add to what was just being said on the last topic. Part of the way that I think about that is, especially when we're under time pressures, but even when we're not, it's important for all of us oftentimes to remember, in all kinds of different settings, to not let the pursuit of perfection be the enemy of the good.
Yes.
I love it.
And having said that, I will move on to my comments about how researchers can optimize the experience of patient partners. And many of my fellow panelists have already touched on so many pertinent issues, but one that I haven't heard that I will touch on again, and it'll be again for those who heard the first edition in this series, and that is about the removal of barriers to participation. I mean, yes, we've heard about asking patient partners how they would like to be engaged, how the role of the researcher is really as the coordinator and the motivator of the entire research team, and it's important to have an understanding for each of those members of what each other does, and to best identify opportunities to cooperate and collaborate rather than compete on the research team. But the issue of removal of barriers to participation, I think, is an important one too, particularly when we're aspiring to have a diverse contribution by patient partners with a variety of different conditions.
Thank you, Kent. Other panelists on how to optimize the experience of patient partners on the grant writing process?
For me, it was the communication. It really has been, and kudos. My first research was with Ruth and a team out of Montreal as well. They worked so hard and diligently on making sure they communicated with us, and it really did optimize the experience, so much so that I wanted to do it again. And we continue on that project as well. We've submitted another grant. It was, declined. We're going to resubmit. And that's something Ruth touched on, that, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. The bottom line is perseverance. But just having the support and the communication was so critical for me to make it a success story, to want me to do more.
Oh, that's a lovely thing, to keep those channels open, keep communicating, whether the news is good or not so good. Yeah. So thank you, Marilyn, for drawing a nice line under that really important word. This whole webinar is about collaboration, but I almost want to say it's about communication as well, as collaboration.
Oh, yeah.
So Annie, I'm going to move on if I can. We're running well with the clock, but I would like you to answer the next question, please. And that is, what can patient partners hope to get out of the experience of collaborating and communicating in the grant writing process?
Like mentioned before, so the patient and the public partners, they can really contribute to the probability of success. So making sure that the patient and public voice is being heard. So I think that's, when you look at the definition of patient-oriented research, and meaning patients and public being meaningfully and actively involved throughout the life cycle of the research project, So the involvement in grant writing just brings it full circle, as well as participation empowers us to really make sure that the project addresses the important issues and or critical barriers, so that there is progress in an area, what is important to the community. And I think it's also fulfilling if you understand the different components of a research project. So the more you're involved in the different areas, the better your understanding is. And you always develop new skills, and hopefully you can share that then with other patient partners, like I mentioned before, in the form of a mentorship.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up again. The mentorship piece is so important, because really each of us at the levels that we're operating as patient partners, we're creating capacity for other patient partners to do exactly the same thing. So Kent and Marilyn, would you like to add to that?
I'll just lead us into the ever-exciting Q&A section to come, just by saying again that I think that in the end, that communication of the results of your impact that you talked about earlier in the presentation is so important, particularly because in most cases, in fact, in every case that I know of, the team that prepares a grant application is the same team that hopes to conduct the research that will follow a successful funding.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the tone that is set by the relational skill of the lead researcher for that team is vital to the success of the research that will follow.
Thank you, Ken.
I'd like to add quickly that it's because we are also patient peer reviewers. So we know what areas are that the patients and the public is looking at. Is that in the proposal? Is that missing and stuff? So that's what makes it really valuable to the research team, I find.
Yes, and in this last COVID round, I was both a peer reviewer and a participant in the grant writing process. So it was a double-edged, it was like a wedge, actually, opening the doors for other patient partners to do exactly the same. So Ken, thank you for that good answer about, and Annie and Marilyn, about what you can hope to get out of engaging. But I'm going to turn it back to you, Ruth, because you're representing a larger group, and that is the researchers. So can you illuminate what can researchers hope to get out of engaging with patient partners in this way?
So I think most obviously, a stronger grant. So and again, that hopefully includes a clearer and more richly thought out plan for patient engagement. I think others have said that the letters of support, both for like the topic of the project as being a priority, perhaps the relevance of outcome measures, can really add strength to a proposal. I think there's some spin-off benefits for the grant as well. So I've found that just being really attentive to clarity of writing and having a grant that all team members can read and understand and can contribute to also means a grant that is more successful at peer review because it's more clearly written. I think also in terms of process, like some of the things I've mentioned around being attentive to roles and expectations and timelines are important to having a stronger team more generally and to sort of function as a group. So that's been an independent benefit for me. And then in the case that it isn't funded, I think I've had experiences where it's still been really valuable in highlighting possible other directions about how we could sort of tweak and pivot in a different direction, other related questions that we might frame up. And so that also when you receive that feedback, at least being able to reach out and having patient partners on the team to help sort of interpret that and make next step decisions has been really valuable for me as well.
Oh, I remember the first time I was involved in grant writing, I was a nervous wreck because I thought I was representing all patient partners. And of course, you're not as a patient partner in the grant writing process. You're representing yourself and your lived experience. So Annie, Marilyn, Kent, anything else that you think researchers could hope to get out of engaging in this way?
Well, I will just say, as I so often do, that at the end of the day, it's so important for everyone in all of these kinds of endeavors to remember that ultimately patient benefit is the point of all healthcare.
Yeah. And Kent, if I can add to that, you know, we've talked about a couple of things through this process. Annie mentioned meaningful research. This really needs to be not a tick in the box, add a patient partner. It needs to be meaningful, and so that starts right at the start of the grant writing. I think when I look at this process for myself, what has it enriched my life with? My bottom line is I have found that my healthcare system has been wonderful for me since inception. It's been great for my children as well. But I am now at a part where our system is changing, and we're in a process and a cycle of change with healthcare. And so how can I contribute? And I find it meaningful just having a voice, having the ability to share. And I think bottom line for me is it helps me know that we're going to have a good basis of a medical system through research in our country. And that's what's so vital and important to me.
And Marilyn, what do you think, just off the cuff here, what do you think about the whole idea of giving back since you've received so much good health care? Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly. It's my way in my lifetime to pave the way for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, to enjoy what I have had the benefits of and continue to, even through the change, to continue to manage my health.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you very much. Annie, would you like to contribute something?
Just some last words. I echo what I heard, but like if you want change, and you have to be the change. So you have to get involved.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. There's nothing like being in the arena of patient-oriented research to understand that healthcare really is a collaborative effort. Kent or Ruth, any last thoughts on any of the last questions before we get into the next step, which is the questions and answers?
More from me. Really excited to hear questions and discussion.
Annie, anything else?
I always love the Q&A as well, but just briefly, I'll just compliment what Marilyn was just saying about the importance of end-to-end engagement, because I think that most of us have had the experience of trying to jump on in the middle of some research preparation or research conduct process in an effort to fill an identified gap in the research team, and then it's the rat race of trying to play catch up to the rest of the members.
Yeah.
And nobody loves that. But even still, I would say never let everything that we can't do make us too intimidated to do everything we can do.
Yeah, that's great. I love that, Kent. Thank you so much, because I think it really is a steep learning curve for patient partners to get involved in grant writing. But as you do it, you become a much better climber throughout the process, and you learn to climb as part of the team. So I'd like to move on if we can. I believe our wonderful support at the BC Support Unit is going to help us with the question and answer.
Yes, Lisa, we have a comment from Gwen that I'm going to convert into a question, but first I'll read the comment because Gwen's made some really lovely points. So for those who are listening to the recording, you won't be reading this, so I'll read it aloud to you, and thank you, Gwen. This is more a comment about reducing barriers so patient partners can be meaningful members of the research team. I think we need to shift from researchers as the only experts to patient partners as experts in their own right. That shifts the balance of power in the equation. What we bring to the team, a rich and vibrant lived experience from and interpretive worldview. This helps in considering language from patients that ultimately translate research into health practices. So I think the question that I'm seeing there is, what can the panelists suggest for reducing barriers for patient partners to enhance that voice at the table?
Since I raised this issue, maybe I'll go first to comment on it. And anyone who wants to hear additional comments on this issue can go back to the first edition in this series and hear what we had to say there. But I do think that removal of barriers is so important, especially because there might be travel considerations, there might be accessibility considerations, there might be comprehension considerations, there might be a need for things in different formats, and that's not something that a lot of research teams have necessarily yet thought as carefully about as I sometimes wish they would. And commenting on Gwen's specific comment, I think it's important also to emphasize that, you know, as much as I have benefited in terms of my ways to engage and my options for engagement because of my health professional background, you don't need to have a health professional background in order to be an effective patient. You only need to have a lived experience and a compelling way to communicate it.
Thank you, Kent, and you have both, let me assure you. Marilyn, Annie, Ruth, let's talk about removing those barriers.
If I can add to what Kent said about the barriers, I think first of all, as a patient partner in all of this, you need to communicate what your barriers are. So if you're a single mom and you need childcare help, you need to communicate that. If you work during the day and you need to participate on off hours, you need to communicate that. These are all barriers. Financially, we've been well supported by BC Support. There are avenues to get financial help, but as a patient first entering this realm, you may not even realize that. And so it comes back to asking the questions and communicating what your barriers are, because often the research leads may not even realize or recognize that you have a barrier because they've never even met you. And so I think it's really critical for patient partners to communicate. And on the other item that was mentioned, are we researchers? Well, I tell people I am now. And am I a qualified researcher? No, but I think I've done enough to say, as Dr. Tom Noseworthy said, patient partners are the North Star of research. It's where we look to get our direction from their lived experience. And so I think it's critical that all barriers, whatever they are, be communicated and be removed for us to be a success.
Thank you, Marilyn. Actually, you are an expert, aren't you? You're an expert in your own condition. Yes.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Annie?
Just to add to all of this is don't just have one of us involved in the project.
Yes.
So get away from the tokenism and to tick off a checkbox. And now that we feel like we are supported and we have also each other to bounce off each other and help each other. So that's important.
That's great. Ruth, would you like to sum up? I'll ask if have a few more comments, but please go ahead.
I might get a little controversial here. For one of the things I've encountered as a barrier is actually that requirement for ongoing participation. That in some cases, folks I've worked with have said, I can provide feedback. I want to see this work go ahead. I'd love to work on the grant preparation, but I can't commit to being available 6 months from now. And that's still been really valuable. So again, the ideal would be that continuity of involvement, but again, I don't want to make that or trade that off against getting all relevant expertise as we're planning a project. So that's been one. Another one for me is the requirement of disclosure, that sometimes the model of patient involvement sort of assumes that people are willing to write a letter of support, describe the experiences they've had, in cases where people might have precarious legal status or where there are highly stigmatized conditions involved, providing ways to contribute to the conceptualization of a project that don't necessarily require public affiliation with those identities or characteristics can be important. And then this is going to be a little bit flippant, but the final barrier is the grant application process itself. Like sometimes being like, let's work on this project. I just need you to work with my RA to do a Canadian Commons CV and write a letter. That sometimes the grant process is just not the way to start out a partnership. And that there can be ways to involve, to make sure that expertise is taken on board with respect to the direction of the project, the outcomes, the research plan, but recognizing that maybe not including the CCV isn't going to be the end of the world. Is it a decision that I've made? So those might be more controversial, but again, with the goal being patient-oriented research, not patient-oriented grants, those are some potential barriers that we've sort of considered.
Thanks,
Not
Ruth.
controversial at all. Sorry, Lisa, I was just going to add, not controversial at all. As far as I'm concerned, Ruth, we love a tough love style approach.
Yes.
and we want those we love, institutionally and otherwise, to do better and commit to a process of constant improvement. And many of those issues you raised, I think, are all just integral parts of the conversation on, what do you need to be engaged effectively, and how would you like to be engaged and contribute?
Exactly. Thank you again, Kent, for summing it up. In some ways, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about patients being involved in grant writing, and we're talking about researchers being involved in grant writing. But I'd like to stress to everyone, especially the people like Annie and Marilyn have talked about earlier, the people that are just getting into this. Remember, it's not us and them. The key word in this is collaboration. Now, the interesting thing is that times are sort of changing, and to follow up on Ruth's last controversial question, I'd like to just end with a brief discussion about patient-led research, because for some of the funding bodies, like Kent talked about at the very beginning, Michael Smith offers a P2P grant where patient partners are actually co-leads. That might even evolve into patients being the leads for some projects. So do any of our panel members have any comments on that as we run down the clock for the last 2 or 3 minutes?
I think
I'll
it's
just say,
great.
oops, sorry, Marilyn, go ahead.
I think P2P grants are wonderful. It's kind of that next step after you have been involved. And again, that lived experience gives us ideas for where we need to take research. So they're wonderful. I've been involved in reviewing P2P grants, never been involved directly, but I think thank you and kudos to those who fund P2P grants.
Yes, and the BC Support Unit. Ruth or Annie, Kent, any last comments?
I think it's just all consistent with this idea of, do the right people with the right expertise, are they around the table? And so I like what I bring to the table. I have always been interested in health services. I draw on personal experiences of caregiving and system navigation in my own research. And I have skills for methods. My expertise is quantitative. That doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be in a leadership role. In fact, my training isn't in leadership, it's in research methods. So I think there are lots of different ways of constituting a team that has the right leadership, that has the right methodological expertise, and that has complementary skills to make sure those methods are channeled in ways that make real difference for health systems. So I think it's just part of a continuum of structuring a team around the problem at hand.
And I'd like to just say thank you for that. And, you know, grant writing, as Gwen has said in the question and answers, it's part of the whole research experience too. So Annie, any last thoughts?
I just wanted to say it's a team effort, and so just making sure that all the different relevant stakeholders are at the table and that we all work together for the common goal.
Thank
Amen
you so
to that.
much. Thank you. I guess we're at the end of a very quick hour. It's certainly gone very fast for us. So just before we hand back to the BC Support Unit, on behalf of all the panelists, I'd like to thank the BC Support Unit for what they are doing for patient-oriented research across British Columbia, especially Pat and the technical support and wisdom provided by Belinda at the unit. And I'd like to thank all of these distinguished panel members for again giving another hour. You must be hungry now for their lunch hour to contribute to the general knowledge of patients and grant writing. So thank you, and back to you, Pat, to close out.
I want to extend the BC Support Unit sincere thanks to our panelists. So Ruth, thank you so much. I know that it's a very busy time for you given the circumstances. Thank you for taking time out to help develop this webinar. Marilyn, thank you so much for joining us from the Interior to help bring your voice to the table. Annie, likewise, thank you for joining us from the Interior. And of course, Kent, it's always great to hear your wisdom from here in Vancouver. Belinda, we appreciate your support so much. And Lisa, we couldn't have done this without your excellent and skillful moderation. So thank you, each and every one of you, and thank you, attendees, for joining the panelists today. And I wish you all very pleasant summer solstices on Sunday, which is also National Indigenous Peoples Day. So I wish you all pleasant Sundays when it comes. Bye now.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.